After rolling credits on The Legend of Zelda Skyward Sword HD on Nintendo Switch, I feel really good about my decision to spend 50 plus hours revisiting the Zelda universe's origin story, warts and all. Divisive as it is, much of what made it great has aged quite well, especially in light of the quality of life improvements and updated graphics. On the other hand, the gimmicky Wii-era motion control mechanics are still constantly right up in your face, and the new thumbstick-based alternative isn't a lot better. But with so much to do and a lot to love, Skyward Sword's journey down memory lane has kept me smiling the whole way through. I've always considered the minimalist visual style of Skyward Sword to be one of the best in the series, and the 1080p 60 FPS upgrade makes the already lovable world of giant birds and creepy mole people all the more beautiful. It's still not as detailed as Breath of the Wild, but it's a massive improvement over the 480p 30 FPS Wii version. Sailing the open desert as a time-traveling pirate is bewitchingly beautiful, and the expressions on characters' faces manage to convey a ton of emotion. Every character is extremely memorable, whether it's a heavy hitter like Zelda, who's more emotional and humanized than she's ever been, or the goofy cast of side characters like Groose, the dumb jock with a heart of gold. Setting the stage for the events of every story that comes after it, and creating an origin for the iconic Master Sword are already impressive feats on their own. The fact that Nintendo pulled it off without voice acting and created such an all-star cast in the process makes me wonder what Faustian bargain was struck to make that supernatural feat possible. Following the typical dungeon-delving formula, you spend most of your time in Skyward Sword HD exploring colorful areas, collecting nifty new gadgets, and solving straightforward puzzles as you slice your way through all kinds of cartoonish monsters. Unique to Skyward Sword is that the 4 main hub worlds are reused heavily as you retrace your steps in your quest to save Zelda, gaining access to new parts of the world as you obtain new gear. The lack of variety is a little disappointing, but it's not as repetitious as it sounds, because world events sometimes change the landscapes over time, and hidden areas reveal themselves during return visits. Of course, dungeons have always been the real meat and potatoes of pre-Breath of the Wild Zelda games, and Skyward Sword mostly delivers in that regard. There are some absolutely fantastic highlights, like the time-shifting, pirate-themed sand dungeons, as well as others that are fairly forgettable, like the by-the-numbers Faron Woods areas that I feel like I've played 100 times already across the series. That's not to say that any of the dungeons are actively not fun to play. It's more that you can only solve a puzzle whose solution is shoot an arrow at an eyeball so many times before you're like, okay, can we get to the boss now, please? Unfortunately, the boss fights are a little hit or miss as well, with repeated encounters throughout that are only slightly modified variations each time, and become monotonous. A few are super generic, like the giant scorpion with eyeballs on his claws that could be used as a stock photo labeled boss encounter. That said, without spoiling anything, I can say that there are a few really stellar boss fights in the back half of the adventure. When it debuted in 2011, there was a lot of discussion around Skyward Sword's heavy use of motion controls, and now, with the remaster offering both motion-based and thumbstick-controlled options, that debate seems primed to reignite. You can disable them, but even if you do, nearly every battle and puzzle incorporates the direction in which you swing Link's trusty blade, and you're often asked to draw a symbol on a wall or some other task that was clearly built with the Wii remote in mind. Using motion controls on a docked Switch, Skyward Sword feels very much on par with the original version, for better and for worse. Swinging your detached Joy-Con around at an enemy can be a lot of fun, but when it occasionally doesn't detect your movement correctly, it's just frustrating and unpleasant. Personally, I don't care for motion controls generally, so I initially turned them off. Disappointingly, the replacement is every bit as much of a pain in the neck and doesn't really solve their reliability problem. For one, you actually have to quickly flick the stick around for a swing to register. Moving it slowly just pulls back your sword. Because I couldn't take the time to line up those inputs, this means a fair amount of the time they didn't go where I'd intended. It's also unintuitively laid out, leading me to accidentally swinging the wrong way in the heat of battle. I ended up going back to motion controls, which made me sad. Aside from these major changes, there's also a bunch of little quality of life stuff that wasn't in the original, like skippable dialogue and cutscenes, autosaves, tutorials at the beginning that are now optional, and no more repeated item explanations every single time you pick something up. These are great changes that genuinely add up to make a noticeably smoother experience. Although, there is one bizarre one in their midst. The not insignificant ability to instantly return to the sky at any time is inexplicably locked behind owning a specific amiibo. Why? Because Nintendo, that's why. Skyward Sword remains as charming as ever, even if it's still also dominated by clunky controls and odd gimmicks that are exactly as weird as you remember them. The characters and story have aged like fine wine, the quality of life improvements help alleviate some of the Wii-era wonkiness, and the improved graphics and performance make this version look and play better than ever. Unsolved control issues aside, this airborne adventure is everything you might expect it to be, for better or worse, and playing through it again had me grinning ear to ear until the very end. For more, check out the first minutes of gameplay and our guide to how Skyward Sword works without motion controls. And for everything else, stick with IGN.